So, hello and welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today we have Jorge Coca, I hope I said that correctly,
Yes,
and
you did.
Felix Angelov, I believe is the right way to say it, or Americanized Angelov, as he's just let me know. These are two guys who are working at Very Good Ventures, which is, to me, like one of the most top Flutter consultancies we have. And I think I'm just going to let them talk a little bit more about themselves because I'm always afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. But so go ahead. Maybe Jorge goes first.
Absolutely, I can do that. So it's very nice to thank you so much for having us on the show. We're ready here to have a good time and to share our story with you and with everyone. Currently, I'm the head of engineering at Very Good Ventures, where I focus on pretty much like growing our team so we can offer the best service to our clients, right? As you said before, Very Good Ventures is a consulting company, right? We try to bring the best possible experience when it comes to Flutter development, right? And so far, we've been very privileged to kind of like be a little bit successful in that regard, right? Like we've been working with Google, with the New York Times, with Betterment, with Policy Genius, with Toyota, right? And it's just very exciting to see the Flutter community growing and to be kind of like leading some of those efforts, both internally and also like publicly when it comes to open source, things like that. And that's the perfect segue to let Felix introduce himself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me as well. I'm Felix, and very similar to what Jorge mentioned, except for I try to focus a bit more on the software side and kind of developing tools as much as possible in the open source, obviously, like he mentioned, to basically help our team and help the Flutter community be more efficient and write higher quality code and make our clients happier at the same time. And I think a little bit about both of us. Probably most people know, but we both used to work at BMW before joining VGV, where we worked on, I worked on web and some iOS. Jorge did a lot of Android. Probably we can tell a funny story later if we have time about how I joined BMW. But we've been working together for quite a while now and have been fortunate enough to be using Flutter for like 3.5 years now, which has been an awesome experience.
There's a funny story about you joining BMW. I think we can talk about that now. Since we would like to talk about you guys at BMW.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of like leading some of the Android efforts in our Chicago office for BMW. And actually, Felix did the interview for my team. So he was supposed to work with me since 2016 or 17, right?
16, yeah.
He passed the interview. He was very knowledgeable on Android. And all of a sudden, one day, I see him in the office, and he's not on my team. And I was like, what the? Turns out that a different team stole him, and he started focusing a little bit on Flutter. And then he started actually leading some of our hybrid efforts with web for BMW, right? Which put him in a really good position to kind of like then join, once we started the Flutter initiative at BMW, kind of like come and work with us. And that's when we started working together in the team. But yeah, it was fun to see him like that he was interviewing for an Android role, and all of a sudden he was not in my team.
Yeah. That was like, to me, the funniest thing is like, oh, so exciting. Like I had been doing Android in college. I was like, oh, this team is awesome. Like I'm going to do Android like at a higher like quality level with a real team with people who are like experts on Android. And then first day I got handed an iOS book and learned Swift. So yeah, that was an interesting experience.
Actually, I think that's a good way of explaining why we got to use Flutter at BMW, right? Which probably is what everyone wants to hear at some point. Like, not the funny stories about the interviews. Let's talk about Flutter. So what happened is that my Android team was quite small, right? The biggest energy or like the biggest focus of BMW was on iOS, up to a point where like you can imagine like maybe having 70, 80, 90, 100 developers focus on iOS. And on Android, we were like 10, 12, right? So it was impossible to achieve feature parity, right? And on top of that, our technology efforts, the way we were doing Android and the way we were doing iOS was quite different. And this started to be a reflection also in the product that we were putting out there. We saw that customers, for example, on the Android project, they would complain not because the Android product was bad, but because they were missing features that they were not part of the Android product, but they were part of the iOS product, right? But also like the user base was like maybe 30% of users using Android and 70% of the users using iOS. So we had a CTO that challenged us. It was like, look, let's put together a research team and see what we can do from the technology point of view to bring feature parity. And we can actually coordinate these efforts with a new kind of like branding of what we do in digital services for BMW and Mini, maybe new designs and all that stuff. So that research team literally focused for like 6 months pretty much in what can we do from the technology point of view to bring feature parity and make sure that both iOS and Android users were happy, were receiving the same feature set, right? So Felix, would you like to talk a little bit about that research process?
Sure. Yeah. It was an interesting process. We kind of split apart into, well, prior to that whole thing, like I joined a little later in the process. So early on, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jorge, but basically the team split up and different individuals took different technologies and did their due diligence, like reading about them, looking at the limitations, evaluating like would they meet our needs. And then we kind of like eliminated a couple. Actually, like there's a funny story as well there with Microsoft and Xamarin, where apparently they literally told us don't use Xamarin. So that was kind of interesting. And so basically it came down to a couple of options that we had. One of them was this cross-platform architecture, right? That was by Uber called Ribs. And then Flutter was another contender, and then React Native was in there as well. But I think we quickly removed React Native from the equation because there were concerns about like it being super open-ended and having to manage all kinds of dependencies and performance and all the usual stuff. And so I think at one point we were pretty sure that we were going to go with Uber Ribs. Like we were like, okay, this is it. This is what our recommendation was. And then we got challenged again, like, okay, let's split in half into 2 different teams, and one team will start rebuilding the app in Uber Ribs with iOS and Android code bases. And the other team will do it in Flutter. And we'll spend like 2 weeks doing this and pretend like each team is actually trying to do this for real. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, let's come back together and then evaluate like how did the progress go? Like how do we feel about them? And the results basically spoke for themselves. I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure we didn't make any progress on Android with the Uber Ribs approach because of the composition of the developers working on it. Whereas with Flutter, we had a working iOS and Android app, and we actually got like a ton of progress in those 2 weeks. And really, like the only questions, I was one of the skeptical people at that time about using Flutter, and it was mainly around the support for native integrations. So like we relied heavily on Bluetooth, we relied on Google Maps, we relied on web views and things like that at the time they didn't really exist, or like they were super early, and we kind of had to just trust that Google was gonna deliver and like support those native plugins that we were gonna rely heavily on in the future. But it was kind of like one of those experiences that I really value because we put aside everyone's opinions and we actually just sat down and looked at like, okay, let's be real, like how much can we actually achieve and what are we actually like afraid of? And then it became really easy to make the decision, and Flutter was kind of a no-brainer at that point.
Yeah, we were very lucky actually to be part of an organization at that point with a CTO leading pretty much all those efforts that gave us the confidence and the support to be like, look, let's try this. Let's give it a try for 2 weeks, then 4 weeks. Let's keep incrementing that span in time. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, right? You don't know what you don't know, and 6 months down the line, you might encounter like, hey, this doesn't scale or anything like that. So that gave us the confidence to be like, okay, we're going to start trying little by little. And when we tried after those 2 weeks, we were like, okay, we're quite happy with the results. Let's keep trying, one more sprint. So we kept trying, and we made more progress, and we were happy. We were like, hey, the application is still super performant, even if we still adding like lots of lines of code, right? The testing level is really good, right? With Flutter, you get like support for testing out of the box immediately. We engaged with the Flutter team at that point to start working about how can we integrate with maps, how can we bring more support for web views and all that stuff. So all the pieces came together, and pretty much we were 6 months into that process, and we're like, okay, there's no way back. Flutter is the solution, right? Yeah. It literally checks the boxes of what we were trying to do when it came to feature parity, new designs, full control over the user interface. But actually, it forced us to do like a few other resets in parts that we didn't consider initially. One of them was actually from the coding standards point of view, actually picking Flutter and reevaluating our like standards, our choices, our practices over CI/CD, rules and all the stuff, made us write better code than what we were doing on the native side. And it also challenged us to kind of like start again as a culture, as a what it means to be a digital organization within a company like BMW that is 100 years old, actually older than that, right? And this sounds crazy because technology companies, right, like the oldest ones, they're like about 20 years old, right? Like actually Google just celebrated like being 23 like quite recently, right? Even the dinosaurs of technology like IBM and Intel are from the 50s or the 60s, and all of the sudden vehicle companies, they've been operating since like the late 1800s or like early 1900s, right? And they are hardware companies ultimately. And now they're catching up to that era of like digital services. So for us, Flutter and many other things, but like this project was the spark to trigger that cultural change, right? So all of a sudden now the entire company started thinking about how to be more efficient, how to actually bring cross-platform, how to improve our internal architectures, right? Like we actually refactor microservices infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We improve our APIs, like a lot, our CI/CD infrastructure, right? We actually brought kind of like modern development to BMW, and that was thanks to Flutter. Like that was the spark that we needed. That was the reset button that we needed.
I think one of the things that even arguably more important than choosing Flutter was, like Jorge mentioned, actually like stepping back and thinking about the APIs, putting like the team in control and like empowering them to have better control over the contracts between the client and the API, and also monitoring. Like I remember even to this day, we kind of had that ability to be like, okay, what are some of the problems that as a front end team like we've encountered in the past? And one of them was always like, oh, the app's broken. And who do people go to when the app's broken? The front end team, even though a lot of times the issue was on the back end somewhere and the client just like was doing its thing, right? And so one of the things that we try to like make a really good point about doing was having monitoring in place so that if things aren't working, it was like super crystal clear where the issue was in the infrastructure. Like, was it a client issue? Was it an API issue? If it is an API issue, at what layer in the back end is the issue happening? Who do we need to contact to address the issue? And so like all of those things all together, I think helped make us way more successful and happier as a development team.
And I think that experience, actually, that's what made the transition to VGV, to Very Good Ventures, to start doing consulting fun and useful, right? We had the opportunity to see Flutter working at scale at an organization. We were able to create some tools, right, like that as part of like our internal refactor at BMW. That's how Felix started writing, for example, Bloc, right? Like Bloc was an initiative, a tool that was born inside BMW. But by making it open source, now we realized that we could actually have an impact in many other organizations that were going through a similar transition or might want to do a similar transition, right? And all of a sudden, we built all this expertise and we realized like, hey, we can use other teams, other companies to grow without having to go through the same pain points that we have already experienced, right? Once you bring a consulting company, if you have the same pain points that you had before, then as consultants, we're not doing anything special, right? We're just kind of like learning as you go, and you cannot consider yourself an expert, right? You want to remove those barriers. And that has been super fun so far, right? Like we've been able to work with many teams, right? And build up even more expertise, more points of view to understand how people actually use Flutter in many different other companies. Because sometimes when you work in a big corporation, it's not that you get a better engineer, you just get to learn how to use the tools that company uses, right? So now we've been exposed to more state management solutions, and that helped us actually to be even more opinionated and defend better the recommendations that we make. it has helped us to like understand better our testing strategy, or understand better like or improve our like state management solutions, right? So that was like very, very impactful as well for us in our career and how we're actually working within the VGV ecosystem.
Yep. One other thing too that VGV has really embraced is just like whenever we can contributing back to open source, like Jorge mentioned. So I think like a lot of big companies, they kind of shy away from that because they're afraid like it's going to leak internal IP or whatever the case might be. Obviously, that's not everyone, but it's been really nice to also have that balance between like we are doing consulting work, we are helping clients, but at the same time, we're also trying to help just like everyday developers or people who are learning Flutter for the first time or whatever the case might be. Like as much as possible, we try to think like, is this tied to a client? If the answer is no, then let's open source it. Let's make it something that not only can other people use, but other people can help us make it better. I think like one of the reasons, in my opinion, why a lot of the open source tooling is usually better than the internal tooling is just because you have so many more eyes on it, so many more people playing with it, trying it, looking at the code, saying like, hey, why didn't you do it this way instead of this other way? And like over time, all that really makes a huge difference. So it's been great to see like that culture and like just the way of thinking at VGV has been like super empowering. And like, yeah, our engineers kind of can, obviously they are working on consulting a lot of times and they are working with clients, but like there's nothing stopping people from hopping over and working on some open source work or writing blog posts and things like that, and kind of just like giving back to the community wherever they can. And luckily, like I think almost everyone, if not everyone on the team, really enjoys that and tries to find ways to make it happen. So yeah, it's been really awesome.
I want to kind of stop you over here real quick. Maybe it's my turn. So I'm going to be a little bit greedy because I'm a big fan of Bloc. And I kind of wanted to talk more about the beginnings of Bloc, right? Because I'm not too sure if Bloc actually came from BMW or just the Bloc library came from your experience over there, or what? Like, where did this whole entire idea of Bloc came from? That's
So the idea of Bloc, the idea of Bloc came from Google, right? Like the ads team at Google came up with this pattern, and they came up with these rules for like what it means to follow this pattern. And I'm pretty sure you can find that talk on YouTube where they first introduced this pattern and gave some snippets of how you can implement it using RX or just like streams and Dart. And so at BMW, that's where the library was born, like Jorge mentioned. So originally we actually started using Redux because what we wanted to avoid is like what was happening in our previous experience on native was it was different depending on the code base. Like iOS had different issues than Android. I think Android sounds like it was a lot more under control than iOS, but at the end of the day, we wanted to have something that was easy, that we could teach new developers pretty quickly, that didn't have a lot of ways for you to shoot yourself in the foot using the approach, and that would scale well and was consistent. And so we started off with Redux. We gave it a try because at the time, I think the only options we had really were scoped model and Redux. So I think we tried all of these different options. And I think even Jorge has an article, it's still on Medium, that's like use Redux and Bloc together. So that was back like in the early days. So we started off just using the pattern. We were using RX Dart. And at least in my opinion, the reason why the library came to exist is because we had this one teammate on our team who was like, I'm not using RX Dart. Like, I'll never use RX Dart. It's way too complicated. It's way too easy to like have memory leaks or make things that are just like impossible to debug or reason about. And even though it's like a really powerful tool, we saw how easy it is to misuse when people aren't familiar with the more advanced concepts. And so that was kind of the inspiration for like, okay, we really like this pattern, but we also don't love all the different ways that you can kind of introduce issues into your code base by following this pattern with the raw like stream implementation. And so the library was an attempt to like take that pattern. Obviously, there's some like room for interpretation about the pattern. I think one of the things that people often like say, oh, the Bloc library doesn't follow the Bloc pattern is because when you see the raw Bloc examples, you usually see a single block with multiple streams and multiple syncs. And with the library, we kind of made the decision that like, okay, each block has a single input and a single output. And we can talk more later about why we made that decision. But ultimately, the goal was to take this pattern that we really liked and try to take away as many of the ways in which you can shoot yourself in the foot as possible while still maintaining the predictability aspect of it, the traceability aspect, the testability aspect. I don't know, Jorge, if you have anything you want to add from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that we knew that RX, like we acknowledge that every application, every user interface application, it's reactive by nature. That doesn't mean that we have to use RX. What we mean by reactive is that you're going to have user interactions coming at any random point in time, right? And once you receive that interaction or the system or whatever, you need to react to that, right? We were experiencing or like kind of like experimenting with the idea of like state machines at the time, right? Coming from the Android community, it was very popular at that time, like different frameworks that were following like the model view intent pattern, right? Like we see, for example, Airbnb, open source Mavericks. We had an internal team actually kind of like toying around with the idea of a library called Circuit. And we really like that idea of like, hey, we acknowledge that our applications are reactive, but at the end of the day, what we're building is an state machine, right? Is that for a given user interaction, once we receive it, we might produce 0, 1, or multiple states, right? So pretty much what we did was to take a little bit of that inspiration, a little bit of inspiration from Bloc, right? And also our little, not our little goals, but our goals. We wanted to have a tool that was easy to test, that was easy to teach, right? We knew that we would scale from our small team of research at that point to 200 developers that kind of like form the BMW ecosystem, right? So we needed to support that level of scale. And we knew that we cannot be in every single pull request being like, hey, this is not how you use streams and all that stuff.
Or you forgot to disclose your subscription. Yeah.
So we were like, how can we acknowledge that our application is reactive, but write our state management solution in such a way that it's just a bunch of if-else blocks or like switch statements, right? Even if we were able to be functional, which maybe one day with Dart, like meta programming, we can be, right? We can achieve all that. And we spent many hours in the whiteboard. And one day Felix just shows up. Like Felix does this thing that like all of a sudden he has that moment and he's like, I got it. I have an idea, right? And he shared it with the team. We started kind of like experimenting with that. We started like writing unit tests. We started writing widget tests. We noticed that made our code much simpler to use, much more readable. We only had to apply one component. It was always like the same steps. It was very prescriptive, right? And all of a sudden, we started avoiding memory leaks. We removed code. We separated our business logic from our user interface. And we were like, okay, this is a big win, right? And at that point, he started like publishing Bloc 0. It took him a while to release 1.0. But that's how it became to be such a popular tool, right? And then after open sourcing it, like we started getting traction from communities not only in the US, but in China, in Europe, right? We all of a sudden hear that this tiny project that we were using at BMW, people want to translate it to Japanese, to Chinese, to French, because they use it over there. And then you hear that, hey, company X, Y, and Z that like are double our size, for example, compared to BGV, right? They're using Bloc and all the stuff. And we're like, okay, he knew at that point that he was after something big. And I think the breaking point for Felix, personally, I see him like his growth, right? When he gave the presentation at Flutter Europe about Bloc, you saw an entire auditorium with hundreds of people just kind of like listening to him, right? And we were able to present a solution that was battle tested by multiple companies, right? That is helping companies to deliver faster and safer. And also super fun, right? And then when you see the community interactions, every time Felix like helps with an issue, or every time someone with the community helps with an issue or give feedback on open a pull request, right? It's a very healthy community. And that's super rewarding as well. Otherwise, I would imagine that he would be burned out quite quickly, right? So all that ecosystem, it's just very, like, for me, it's amazing to see.
Yeah, the experience of going from like, I think to me, that was the most exciting part about picking up Flutter is looking at pub.dev and being like, okay, it's a blank canvas. Like there's literally so many things that need to be built. Like at the time, one of our, like, at least personally, one of my role models was Brian Egan, because he was like the author of all these amazing packages on pub.dev. And so like one of the things that I still remember doing early was just like examining like, okay, how did he structure his code? How did he test his code? How did he set up his CI/CD? Like there was so much learning from looking at like this new, I think that was kind of probably like one of the most important things is being involved at that time where there wasn't so much noise. It was still like relatively small, and being able to kind of have that focus and look at like, okay, how are these really influential people like making things and helping the community, and then just basically trying to take as much as possible from them and apply those same concepts to any ideas or problems that we had to solve. And so I think like BMW was great because we had to figure out how to solve things at scale. And I think now at VGV, it's a different kind of scale because we have to find something that works decently well for like all kinds of different problems. It's not just like a single problem, but with like hundreds of people or like millions of users or whatever the case might be. Now it's like take that problem and multiply by however many companies we're working with.
Instead of scaling just one company, right? We're helping dozens or like on the 20 numbers and all the stuff or even more. Mm-hmm. All those companies at the same time to scale, right? So we just added some extra complexity, but at the same time, that's part of the fun, right? Like it's make sure that you're able to come up with a process, a standard, a tool that can have an impact regardless of your team size, regardless of your culture, regardless of your like team of developers, right? We always say that the way we consider scale is that the same solution needs to work efficiently, whether you're a team of 1 or 3 or 100, right? And that's part of the fun is like think about those APIs, those interactions, and how to make it work together.
Actually, so maybe we can talk a little bit more. Sorry, I'm a little bit interested in Bloc because, like I said, I don't know if I said this already, but I use it personally and I quite like it. I know somebody else. I just brought on another guy. He says he uses the Bloc pattern, but I guess he uses RX more than this Flutter Bloc thing. So he's actually kind of struggling with the Bloc library. So it's good to have you on. So maybe he can watch this and kind of get more of an idea. But there's actually multiple different kind of Bloc flavors, I would say, in terms of like these Bloc packages. Some of you actually just asked in the live stream about Angular Bloc, and his specific question was something like, is there many people using Angular Bloc to share logic between Dart and Angular besides Google?
Yeah, it's a good question. So like, I believe that it's in this kind of like maintenance mode now, Angular Dart, and they aren't going to be delivering like massive new features, unfortunately. But yeah, I think like back when we first started, one of the reasons why people even like looked at this block pattern thing was because there was no Flutter web. And that was like one of the easiest ways to share your logic across web applications using Angular Dart and mobile applications using Flutter. And so it was kind of like a no-brainer at that time to try to support Angular Dart as well as Flutter and like make it easy to integrate the same business logic component in both frameworks. And so I've kind of just like tried to keep up with it and keep upgrading as new updates came around. But I mean, personally, beyond just making like examples and helping people with issues, I actually haven't made a production application using Angular Dart. I'm not sure, Jorge, if you have, but I do know there are some like diehard Angular Dart people out there that I've encountered that are using it all the time. And I'm sure within Google, like you mentioned, there are a lot of people using it, but I think it just never picked up as much traction externally as something like AngularJS, for example.
I would like to talk more about these different flavors of Bloc. So, sure. I mean, obviously we got Bloc, which is pretty interesting. You can use it outside of Flutter. You have Angular Bloc, as you just talked about, which is also interesting. But you have Hydrated and Replay. Like, where did these things come from, and why do you guys decide to support them and not like, you know, somebody else? Like, what's the point of making these?
Yeah. So basically, Hydrated Bloc was like another thing that came up at BMW, and it was just like, it was kind of like a thought experiment of like, I mentioned early on, we made that one decision, that opinionated decision about the blocks from the Bloc library will have only a single input and a single output instead of multiple inputs and multiple outputs. And that's kind of like one of the biggest differences between the raw, like vanilla implementation versus using the library. And one of the key benefits, in my opinion, of that approach is it gives you way more opportunity to do things like some of these packages like this hydrated block and replay block, because by having a single point where every state change has to happen, you can do really cool things like with hydrated block. You can persist automatically those state changes on disk or wherever you want, really, and then restore them the next time the application restarts or the block is reinstantiated. So it makes it really nice for like simple like offline support for basic things where you don't really need to do much besides provide a to and from JSON implementation to tell it how to serialize and deserialize the state. And it uses Hive by default, but you can plug and play with whatever storage implementation you want. And replay block was kind of similar. Actually, that one came from the community. I think it was Rody Davis's idea. It was similar. It was like, okay, now that we have like this single point where all the state changes are happening and you can track the history of state changes, wouldn't it be cool if you could automatically undo and redo, so you maintain that kind of like history and people can replay state changes? I think in particular to me that was cool for like the potential of building some dev tools, kind of like the Redux dev tools where you do that time travel and you can go back and forth in time. And so, yeah, I think like all of these things, they came from like a necessity to support this type of functionality, and the packages were kind of like our attempt at the simplest way to achieve that. And so, yeah, I think like those are things that they just are not too difficult to maintain. Like I think those packages are relatively stable. Like the feature set is relatively focused, and so it made sense, in my opinion, to kind of maintain them as part of this ecosystem and like try to keep them up to date whenever there are breaking changes or major updates to the library. There's actually another one that's not. It's kind of like more neglected, in my opinion. It's that sealed Flutter block, which was it was kind of like an experiment back in the day of like, can we bring sealed unions to blocks? Since like Jorge mentioned, it would be really nice if instead of having if else's or switch statements, you can actually enforce that every single state or every single event is handled and the UI handles every single state. And so, I mean, some packages are more successful than others, obviously, but I think overall it's kind of just the approach we took was try to make things that are really focused and are good at doing one thing, and then allow the community to kind of pick and choose which ones they want to use and which ones they don't want to use, rather than having maybe like something that has all kinds of functionality baked in and you're forced to take it all in and learn how to use it. So I think that separation and building kind of like a mini ecosystem of packages has been useful, both from being efficient as a developer, but also like not being overwhelmed with like any individual API. Like most of them have really small API surfaces, and hopefully they're pretty straightforward to figure out how to use. But yeah, I think they're all kind of like good examples of how you can leverage like the simple concept of one input, one output, and you have access to every single state change in one spot. There are some really cool things you can do that I think even today, like we haven't fully taken advantage of. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there to build more and add to that ecosystem.
I'm also kind of curious though. I think blocks, if I create a block, I should make it really stateless, right? Like the way I look at a block, the way I tend to use blocks is that I make my block kind of like a controller. It doesn't really hold state. It's not really persistent necessarily. But I have like a repository that I stick in there, and that one is usually where I try to have like the state interactions and this kind of stuff. I'm not too sure if that's actually the right way to do it, but that's the way I do it. Like, do you think this is a good pattern, or do you think that there's better patterns than something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. I think the idea that you mentioned, like thinking of it as a controller, I think a lot of people think of it like that, and I think it makes sense. Like, I think people are used to MVC, and blocks in many ways are very similar to controllers. I think at VGV, we try to keep the block, I mean, even though it might not have its own like private state that you're maintaining as part of the block class itself, it still does hold state, right? Because that is what the UI is reacting to. So it's still stateful. But yeah, generally we try to avoid having internal state like explicitly added to the block and treat everything, all state related changes through the state model. And then repositories, we also try to keep stateless as much as possible, or at least like decoupled from the app lifecycle as much as possible. Actually, Jorge had a really good blog that we can maybe link to where we talked about like how we organize our code and set up like a scalable architecture and like the different layers of the application. We can talk more about that if you're curious. But yeah, I definitely think like the controller mentality makes a lot of sense. And like just trying to make your UI as simple as possible is like kind of one of the biggest wins in my opinion. And trying to think of everything in terms of features and in terms of like the state that drives that feature, so that the UI is just responsible for, well, how do I show the user whatever I need to show the user, and not necessarily like interpreting data and manipulating data. So yeah.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about how you guys do your architecture, right? Because yeah, the nice part about Flutter is that it's open for people to kind of experiment and do their own way, but then at the same time, it's like, well, I think there's some good patterns that people need to promote, at least, because yeah, things could become spaghetti really easily, especially because Flutter is so easy that beginners can come to it, right? And I notice I'm in a lot of the beginner communities, just like not because I'm a beginner or whatever, but just there's just so many of these, because there's just I don't know, this is very easy. The onboarding to Flutter is so straightforward. The fact that it's really focused on visual, right? If you're like typing stuff and then like console code coming back to you, it's like it's not so attractive. You don't really understand what's going on. But then if you could say, oh, I know what a button is, I know what an app is, I use my phone all the time, that's much more like, yeah, I'm actually creating something versus like a console-based app, which everybody usually begins with. But I wanted to ask one quick question. So I'm interested to use Bloc in certain other places that I haven't really done before, which is like form validations. And I did check out your form validation code. And the funny thing is that I've seen, at least when I'm working with Bloc, you guys try to push people to use the stream output function. It's was it event-to-state? I think it's called. I forgot. mapEventToState, I think it's called.
Yeah, that's deprecated now, but that was the old API. Yeah.
So it's deprecated now. Okay.
But yeah,
because maybe. So that's what I usually use, I think. But what I've noticed is that your example for the form part is using this on, and I looked up on in the docs, and it says don't use this. This is internal or something like that. And so I'm getting confused about what I should be using, what I shouldn't be using now.
Oh yeah, I mean, let me know where in the docs it says you shouldn't use on, because you should use on. On is the new API that is like the goal is to replace mapEventToState. I can drop a link to the proposal. So currently, like the latest stable release, you still have the ability to use the old mapEventToState API and the new API, so that you can kind of gradually migrate blocks one by one, and you're not forced to do it all at once. But yeah, the recommendation is all the examples in the repo on the master branch should be using the latest versions of the API. So I definitely recommend following whatever you see in those examples. And partly the reason for switching to this on, like to make a long story short, it addresses some predictability issues that we were running into that developers would often encounter when using nested async generators. With mapEventToState, everything usually was async generators. And when you start composing an async generator from other async generators, there are certain cases that don't behave as you'd necessarily expect as a developer. Also, just like the concept of an async generator and the yield and yield star or yield each keyword, those things were like more advanced concepts that kind of scared developers. And the last bit that kind of this whole on API attempts to improve is the ability to specify like how your events are going to be processed, in what order are they going to be processed, etc., and to make that a little more like accessible to developers. And so yeah, this on API was kind of the solution that we arrived upon to try to both unify the Bloc and Cubit APIs a bit, because with that new API now, you're just using this emit function in both places. So if you're using Cubit and then you move to Bloc, it should feel a lot more familiar, and the migration should be a lot simpler. And then also to eliminate a lot of these more advanced concepts and room for error. Like I mentioned before, like the whole point of Bloc was how can we eliminate the like uncertainty or like ability to use the tool incorrectly, or like introduce bugs that are hard to track down. And so this migration to this on API was an attempt to like even further try to make the library a little safer, a little more predictable. So the on event API just allows you to register an event handler, and on accepts a generic type for the event that you want to react to. And so you can register one or more event handlers, and then every time you add an event of that type, the handler will get called, and within the handler you have access to both the event that you added as well as this emit, and you can use emit to emit one or more states. And so you can make your code look very similar to the way it did before with mapEventToState, only you don't have to deal with async generators and the yield keyword. Yeah,
I was just searching the docs as you're talking because I could have sworn I saw that on was the other way around. That's why I was getting confused. Maybe
yeah.
I
Let me
looked
know
at the wrong thing.
if you find where that is. That shouldn't be the case. On is the new API. So
I feel like I must have been dreaming because I don't see it now. Maybe I looked at something.
maybe you're thinking of the only thing that I can think of is the emit from Bloc. Yeah, emit from Bloc is internal. So yeah, with Cubit, if you use Cubit, you might be used to just being able to call emit from anywhere in the class. Like you can emit within the constructor body, you can emit within the close method, you can emit anywhere. And with Bloc, like one of the core differences, right, is that you only want to trigger state changes in response to an event. So the reason for that is we don't want people to just be able to call emit from anywhere. There's a difference between the emit function that Cubit has access to and the emitter that your event handler gets. And so you're probably browsing through the source code, I'm guessing, of Bloc, and you ran into the emit override on Bloc that's like, don't use emit, don't call emit directly. You should only use the emit that's provided via the event handler callback so that every single state change is tied to an event. Otherwise, if you don't find value in that, just use Cubit. It's the same thing without the events.
I think your last comment that you just made about Cubit is very interesting because, like, I had no idea that there was such thing as a Cubit until recently. I was kind of browsing about how can I use a Bloc better because I just felt like I wasn't using it to full potential. Mm-hmm. And this guy mentioned Cubit. I'm like, what the heck is a Cubit? And I'm like, wait a minute. So we got Bloc base, and I think Bloc base you have like
Cubit and Bloc.
I don't know if it's a straight. Is it like linear or not? I don't know, but it's like at least there's two children somewhere.
Yeah.
Whether it's a grandchild or not, I don't know.
Yeah, Bloc base is the base class, and then Cubit and Bloc both implement that interface. So the reason for that is so that all of the Flutter widgets like Bloc Builder, Bloc Listener, Bloc Provider, they all are compatible with Bloc and Cubit. So that if you do migrate between those, you don't have to change any of your UI code. All your UI code should work exactly the same way. And similarly, the tests, like the Bloc test package, everything is implemented against that Bloc base class. So that it doesn't matter whether you're using a Cubit or a Bloc, you have kind of this interoperability across all the ecosystem. So, and all that really, it's pretty recent. I mean, to me, it feels like a long time ago, but relatively recent, the whole like Cubit concept. And that really just came about because it's actually a funny story as well. Like there was a developer one night that was like, oh, can you help me with Bloc? Like I'm really not sure like if I'm using it correctly or not. And they basically shared code with me where they kind of bypassed the entire mapEventToState function entirely. And they were just trying to use Bloc in a really simple way where they would define methods on their Bloc and then they would call those methods from the UI directly. And then they wanted states to be emitted. And I was like, well, at first I was like, well, oh, you're like missing the point. Like events are so beautiful. Like, why aren't you using events? And then it kind of dawned on me like, okay, like everyone doesn't necessarily want to use events. It's an extra step that you have to think about. Like maybe the feature you're building doesn't need events, doesn't benefit from being event driven. And maybe it's easier to think of things as just like actions. Like developers are, I think a lot of times, especially if you're newer to programming, it's a lot easier to understand. I call a function and something happens as opposed to I add an event and then at some point later in time, that event gets processed and then something happens. And so, yeah, the whole idea behind Cubit was like, okay, let's make this same approach with the same kind of benefits of predictability, testability, all that stuff a little more accessible and a little easier with less code for maybe use cases that are simpler and don't really require this like event sourcing, traceability that comes with Bloc. So yeah, that was kind of like how that came about. And a lot of the examples in the repo, they try to show like different use cases where you can use Bloc and Cubit together on their own. Actually, we have some blogs that kind of talk about the differences as well. And there's like in the core concepts in the docs that tries to explain a bit like when you would use one versus the other. But yeah, that's a little bit of the history of how it came up. And like I always tell people, if you're not sure which one to use, you can try Cubit and then you'll know if you need Bloc when you need it. I think at VGV, we kind of just default and use Bloc for everything just because we're so familiar with it and we really like the traceability aspect that you get from it. Like, you know exactly how every state change happened and you know what actions led to that or like what events led to that. But if you're not sure and like that doesn't sound like, oh, that's amazing, then you can try just using Cubit. You'll probably be able to achieve like a lot of the same things with less code. And then when the use case arises that you need it, you can easily, or at least the goal is that you can easily refactor your Cubit to a Bloc and minimal changes to the UI, minimal changes to your tests. So, yeah.
Also, the Bloc observer thing is pretty interesting too. I thought that was definitely the most useful thing because I kept like having like errors here and there, and then like at least now I can get onto the error and then like send it over to Sentry or whatever kind of error tracking thing. It's much more centralized. I love that idea. I was kind of curious about how the heck that thing worked. I guess there must be some kind of central pub sub or something. I'm not too sure how the heck something like this actually works.
Oh yeah, so the block observer, there's just a single instance of the observer. And so, yeah, the way it's pretty simple. It's just every single block has a reference to the single instance of the observer and just reports anytime a state change happens or anytime an event gets added, like all these different things that you might want to know as a developer. We actually recently expanded the API so you can hook into anytime a block was created, anytime an event was added, anytime a state change happens, anytime an error happens, and then anytime a block was destroyed or closed. So it should give you, a really good sense of like what's going on and in what order things are happening and how you ended up at a certain state. It's great that you mentioned like you use it for Sentry and like hooking it up, because that's exactly what we use it for at VGV as well. Even analytics, it's super handy. So yeah, like for us, that was one of the cool things. Again, from like making this opinionated decision about rather than multiple inputs and multiple outputs, if you constrain that, you actually like open the door for a lot of cool things. And like this is another one of those where it makes it so much easier to observe like how your app is behaving. And it's awesome that you use it. That's something that like a lot of people actually overlook, in my opinion. And to me, that's also like one of the coolest things. So I'm glad that you've used it.
Yeah, it's one of the best things is that it allows us to actually automate some of the business requirements and just focus on adding business value or business logic to our project, right? In the past, we've seen many code bases in which like you might have your controller or whatever you use for business logic. And within that, you have to track analytics, right? And every time someone touches a button or something like that, you want to send an analytic event and all the stuff. And that's tedious, right? And that is not part of your like bringing user value. Is just some internal requirement that you have to track what the user is doing, right? So one of the nice consequences of Bloc Observer is like you can trace every single action, actually transaction or change, right? Depending whether you use Bloc or Cubit, right? Just inject your analytics manager, your developer's logger or whatever in the Bloc Observer and start using it, right? You can actually even be like a little bit more specialized. And for example, your events, if you want to use like a mixin to say like, hey, this event needs to participate on analytics, right? You can filter those in your on transition callback or whatever, and just send whatever you've decided to mark as an analytic event, send it to Firebase Analytics or Segment or whatever you want to use, right? So that just with a few lines of code, you automated your entire analytics system without having to convolute really your business logic. And that is a huge win that I feel like is not highlighted enough. And for us, it's like,
this is part of the reason why we just default to Bloc everywhere, because it just gives us that extra level of like observability, especially when trying to debug things or understand like what led to a certain consequence. Like if an exception was encountered, for example, it makes it really easy to retrace like what a user did. I think Jorge had a really good slide at one of his talks. I think it was also at Flutter Europe. In his talk, he had like just a screenshot of logs from Bloc Observer, and without looking at the UI, without looking at anything, it was really clear to tell exactly what had happened. Like the user had filled in some form with some information, they hit this submit button, and then they got into some error state. And like you don't need to look at UI, you don't need to like reverse engineer a bunch of stack traces or anything to figure out how that error happened. You can just look at these logs that you didn't have to write much code at all to get. And yeah, hopefully it saves you a lot of time and makes it a little simpler to...
Actually, the combination of those logs coming from Bloc Observer plus the naming convention that like it's captured in the Bloc documentation, right? That naming convention, while it can be quite verbose, then it's going to allow you to truly understand how those logs could read like, right? And the power of that is by automating all that stuff. Imagine that you're like a huge application, right? Like you could be Pinterest, or maybe not Pinterest, but imagine that you're like, I don't know, like a company that sells like flight tickets, right? And something goes wrong and you call customer service. Customer service could actually have a debugging session with that particular customer in which they can see in real time all the logs that they're producing. And that you just pretty much get it for free, right? It's not just for analytics or developer logs. It could help your entire call center to understand what could be problems in the app, right? Mm-hmm. Quite easily. And that is super powerful. That like live debugging remote sessions, automated analytics, and all the stuff. It's definitely one of the huge wins of blocks, actually.
Yep.
I think that the magic to me is like, how does it actually hook in? Because I'm so used to things kind of being very exact, and it's like you would have to pass it in or something like it. Just seems like, because you just create a block observer, and then I'm not sure how the heck they get hooked up, because it's just not clear. That part is...
Oh, yeah. That part...
I like it, but also at the same time, I'm like, wait, this is a little bit magic. I don't know if I like that part, but I do like the observability.
I think I can help a little bit with that explanation, because I've been doing actually like training today about that, so I can help. So think of Block Observer as a tiny spy that sits in between your single entry and your single, like we said that blocks, events are a single input, right? And the outputs, the way you emit states, they're a single output as well. I'm not going to get into the technical explanation. Felix can do that way better than I do. But just for the concept, is because you have a single input and a single output that Block manages, you can have a tiny spy sitting in between those, just looking at everything that is going on, right? And because you have full control over that single input and output API, that's how you can report back to Block Observer. So while it might look like a little bit of magic, it's actually that decision of having a single input API and having a single output API what allows you then to report those stuff, because you control it, right? So that's the idea. The technical implementation, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's literally...
Yeah, and for the technical aspect, right now, the way it works is your block observer, it's actually just a singleton, right? Like there's just a single instance of block observer for your entire app, and you can customize that by saying block.observer equals whatever you want your observer to be. And because there's just a single instance of the observer, all the blocks have access to that single reference of the observer so that they can report whenever these important things happen, like an event is added or a state change happens. Something that we're actually like experimenting with and trying to play around with. The reason for that decision, by the way, is because we wanted this functionality to be like pure Dart. But one of the things that at least I've personally been thinking about more is how can we leverage the widget tree in Flutter so that you can provide different implementations of this observer. Maybe you want like the logs for a subtree of your app to be reported differently than the logs for another subtree of your app. Like maybe if the user isn't logged in, you want the logs to go to bucket A, and if the user is logged in, you want the logs to go to bucket B. I don't know, hypothetical example, but in those cases, you could leverage the widget tree and something like provider or inherited widget and scope different observers to different parts of the widget tree. But then that starts getting into like, now this is a platform-specific implementation that only works in Flutter. It won't work in like Angular Dart, for example. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there. Similar for like hydrated block you mentioned, like the way that the storage works for that is the same thing, right? Like there's a single instance of that hydrated storage that all the blocks have a reference to and they know how to use. But then if you want, like, for example, again, like if I'm logged in, I want to store things in like, I don't know, key store, keychain, terrible example, but assume that's the case. And if I'm not logged in, I just want to store them in memory. Like that would be possible if we had a way to basically scope those to different parts of the widget tree using something like inherited widget or provider. So those are some things that I think, at least I'm personally like thinking about a lot and trying to experiment with and see like what can we do there and how can we like leverage. Jorge talks a lot about like leverage the widget tree. The widget tree is your best friend. It's like the perfect data structure to represent the state of your application and to scope different aspects of different dependencies and things like that. And so, yeah, we're always thinking of like, how can we leverage the widget tree that Flutter gives us as much as possible?
I was just thinking it could be great to have like multiple block observers, like this one's for logging, this one's for whatever.
So for
that would be
for that
really
actually,
great.
like we recently, one of our clients actually had that exact same feedback, and you can achieve that really easily by just create a custom block observer, call it like multi-block observer, extends block observer, and then in the constructor accept a list of more a list of like block observers, right? And then in your multi-block observer, now you can just in on transition go through your list of block observers and call on transition on each of them. So you can easily build that component yourself without a lot of code. Go ahead, Jorge. You're gonna say something.
No, I was going to say that it looks like we have two blog ideas. One explaining how we can automate analytics and all the stuff.
Yeah, how you can have multiple observers. Yeah, because that's something that a lot of people ask. They're like, oh, I want one that's just printing to the console and one that's like logging to Sentry, like you mentioned, for example, or doing other things. And yeah, that's hopefully like pretty straightforward. We can take that back and maybe release a blog post on how that would look, and I can put like a gist together of how that could look. But yeah, hopefully, like the idea is to make it as easy as possible to customize and extend a lot of this functionality and make it your own. I know, like you mentioned early, one of the things, the challenges and like the pros of Flutter is it's so open-ended. So like you can do whatever you want, but you have to make all these decisions about how to do things. And so like that's always the balance. But hopefully, like at least what we were intending with Bloc is to give you something that makes decisions for you in a way that like puts you on the right path, but still leaves the door open for you to customize whenever like you really have specific use cases or you want to like push the tooling even further. And if not, open a PR, open an issue and open a PR, and then we'll figure out how to make it happen.
Yeah, I have much more questions I want to ask about like some other things, but I feel like I'm taking up too much of Felix's time in terms of leaving Jorge in the corner to.
I mean, every time Felix speaks, like the only thing that I can do is just to sit and listen because it's amazing to listen to him, right?
No,
I'm very privileged, honestly, to work
for Jorge. So. I agree.
No, definitely. So we may. I think it'd be a good idea if we maybe have a second session, maybe more of your open source efforts and maybe digging into.
Yeah.
Things.
I mean, I think you'll find like Jorge and I can talk for forever on all of these topics. So yeah, we can schedule follow-up sessions on more specific topics.
Sounds good to me. Yeah. So I want to kind of go back to you guys' story, right? So you guys, as Jorge seems to be kind of hinting at, is like you guys have a very close relationship, right? So like you guys were at BMW, you put together this great solution. You seem to mesh really well together. Like what happened that you guys decided to kind of leave BMW and go to, sounds like you went straight to VGV, right? Like, or was it you guys started VGV or I don't actually know the history of VGV.
No, we didn't start VGV. We're not part of the OG team. We joined kind of like VGV was born in 2018, right? And we joined in January 2020. But VGV, there was already like a team in there. So David, our president, one of like the only OG developer that still is in the team is Kevin Gray, who has been there since the very first day. But then we also had teammates like Al, for example, that actually, if you watch the Hamilton videos and all that stuff, he shows up in there, right? We were with Kevin in the past, with Martin, like all amazing teammates, right? But since then, the company has grown quite a lot, and we've been enjoying kind of like the growth of Flutter as well, right? For us to leave BMW, it was just like, I think we were ready for the next challenge. BMW, it's a big corporation, right? Both of us, we started rewriting the project, but at some point we realized like, hey, this product, in one way or another, we've already put this in the market, right? I did it with Android. Felix did that when he was working on the web team and iOS, right? So at that point, it just kind of like stopped being that interesting. It was kind of like a nice scaling problem, but at the same time, it's like, okay, we've already built anything that we could build when it came to like the core vehicle stuff, right? And we were kind of like ready for the next challenge. And it's funny because we both knew that we have good chemistry working together and that we wanted to go to the next adventure together. So even for a while, we were thinking about like, what if we start our own startup? I think I still have like a couple napkins with ideas, right? We were thinking about starting like a Flutter school and all those things. And ultimately, we had this conversation with David and like our old teammates from BGV, right? And in my case, for example, I'm a huge musical fan. I love Hamilton. And I was like, it's really nice that there's a company in there that has been working on the Hamilton app, that they do Flutter and all that stuff. I met some of the teammates at DroidCon New York 2019. I had a good relationship with Martin Rivak, for example, that was in the team at that point and was leading the Flutter NYC community. So it just kind of like everything aligned. And I told Felix, like, look, I think that this could be a good company. I already had like an initial chat, and I told David, our president, it's like, well, if we're going to do this, I might bring another teammate, right? And immediately the reaction was like, well, then we started an office in Chicago, and like it became this much larger project that was quite ambitious for the scope of VGV and gave us a lot of opportunity, right? And it allowed us to start introducing like some of the practices that we had at BMW, right? Now at VGV internally, how we can make our processes more efficient. We started working with other customers and evangelizing these same practices, refining our processes, right? And all of a sudden, that attracted a lot of attention, right? At that point, we were a little bit known already in the community. So when we joined VGV being the first in Flutter and now opening this office in Chicago with Felix and myself, gave it also like a little bit more of visibility, right? So now, for example, if you think about Toyota using Flutter, right? All of a sudden, we're also in the vehicle industry that use Flutter. So that brings a certain level of confidence, right? We started also like attracting more talent, right? For example, our teammates in Poland, right? Like Dominic, Jay in Netherlands, Oscar in Spain, they joined VGV because we started growing a little bit more remotely. And all of a sudden they're like, well, I know Felix, it's amazing. I want to work in that company. Or with Oscar, it's like, oh, there's another Spanish developer in the team. I want to join the company, right? So all the stuff created traction, right? And since then, we've also been very lucky to work with customers, right, that trusted us, right, that allowed us to use like Bloc and the level of testing that we set as our own standard and keep growing our open source initiatives and all the stuff. And we've been able to deliver successfully. It's funny because we go and work with many clients, right? And we've had this comment many times that is like, wow, since I work with the VGV team, this is the first time that we finish a sprint on time, that we actually have time for tech dev and all those things, right? And they're actually even like, sometimes they're not even tech dev. So we just finish earlier and we can get to do more interesting things or just kind of like we meet the deadlines, right? Because our ultimate goal with these patterns is not just to be technically perfect, right? But we think, we believe, and we can prove it with data that we can ship faster, right? At the end of the day, if you don't buy time, you're kind of like losing money. So shipping faster is important, but you also want to ship safer, right? And our testing strategies, Bloc, and all the stuff is what achieves that as well. It's unfortunate that Facebook kind of like has this mantra of like ship fast and break things, right? We don't like breaking things. We don't like receiving like 2 a.m. calls because something broke. We just want to be boring as a company, but boring in a good way. And like, let's avoid all those type of surprises, right? So that's a little bit our story, is that we kind of like, we needed a different challenge, and VGV, even though was small, and we're still quite small as a company, we're just a drop of water in the ocean, right? We're about 35 people right now total, the entire company. We still have like really ambitious goals, right? And we have the opportunity to, or selfishly, it's very important for us that Flutter is successful, right? Because you just need one bad example of a Flutter implementation to kind of like have the community being like, oh, Flutter is not a good framework, blah, 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 right? So it's in our best interest to evangelize these good practices, to make sure that we produce good code bases, right? That to make sure that we can create a healthy community as well, right? So if we can be leading that effort, it's a challenge that we're willing to accept and kind of like build together, right? So selfishly, because we only work with Flutter, it's in our best interest that everyone, even like other consulting companies that might be considered like business competitors, they're actually successful. So we have nothing to hide when it comes to our practices and the way we work, right? Like if you look at Photo Booth, that is an open source project that we did with Google for Google I/O, right? That is literally how we treat any other client project, right? That level of testing, modularization, state management, and all the stuff, that's what we offer. You want to see how VGV works? You can just look at the Photo Booth project, right? And it's amazing. Actually, that project has received so much praise and so much good feedback from the community, right? Like, I don't know. It's been really rewarding to join VGV, to grow the team, to grow the company, right? To create the open source community that we're creating, to offer training services and all the stuff, right? We're always kind of like finding that opportunity that is going to help us to grow as a team, right? And it's going to also kind of like fulfill our fun needs, right? Like we do this also because we want to have an impact, and so far we've been able to do so.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think VGV is definitely one of the top, if not the top, Flutter consultancies. So it's really an honor to have you guys on and to hear, where you guys came from, like how you got started. And I think that's also the great part is like hearing how you guys got started in Flutter. It's like, hey, that relates to me. I kind of also tried different solutions and it just didn't work out, and Flutter just did. And the difference between you and I is basically you guys strove hard to try to find the perfect kind of state management solution, and you came up with something, and then you guys iterate and kept going with it, and then also finding the ability to do best practices. But it's good to hear, this.
I think we were lucky.
It's definitely a story. Sorry, of kind of like being in the right place at the right time. Also.
Yeah. I think we were fortunate enough to be around, and like we're presented with this opportunity when there was kind of, like I said, like a blank slate in front of us, and like there was a lot of opportunity to have a big impact. And so I think state management is like one of those controversial, like hot topics, and like whenever there's a new state management approach, like the community goes crazy, like criticizing and like determining like where does it fit in the ranking of the 1 million other state management libraries. But I think like even today, like there's so many exciting challenges for how to do things in Flutter that are currently difficult. Like navigation is a great example. There's like tons of people spending a lot of time on like how can I make navigation simpler, leveraging like the new APIs that came out in Flutter, or how can I leverage tooling to kind of help statically analyze code to make sure that it's safer, or like make sure that we can catch issues faster, or like make sure that it's accessible. So I think like there's always challenges, and it's just a matter of like being in the right spot where like one, you can focus on addressing that challenge and like have the headspace and time to do it, and then two, to like share that challenge or share that solution with everyone and try to like kind of make it accessible and available to the larger community. So I think we were at the right place at the right time to have an impact with like state management and Bloc, for example. But I think like there's a million ways. I wish I just had more time and I didn't have to sleep at night, because there's like a million things that need work and could benefit from support. And I think that's what's great about Flutter is like the community is so transparent. The code base is open source. Like everything it's just a matter of time and like wanting to do it, and like nothing is really stopping you. You just have to pick a problem and then sit down and like start at a whiteboard, like jotting ideas down and try a bunch of things and see what works.
Yeah. So that said, if someone has that same level of passion or interest to kind of like solve those type of problems, right? One of the things that we're gonna do is to actually have a real, fully functional open source team, a team that can be focused to these challenges that we want to tackle for the community and keep having an impact and improve the Flutter ecosystem, right? Felix is gonna be leading that effort, right? So just check our website, the career section, and there's an entry for open source engineers, right? We're like always looking for like junior engineers, senior engineers, right? Program managers. We're also growing in Europe, right? So don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. We're always opening our door to kind of like keep growing and bring talent to the team and keep improving the Flutter ecosystem, both with companies, but also with the external community.
Okay. And I think with that, I think this is a good way to kind of stop the session, because we can talk for hours, right? We're already a little bit over time, but I think that's okay. I really appreciate you guys coming on. We can probably discuss over email about another session. I think that would be great if you have some ideas or something. Definitely. I think
absolutely.
I definitely have a lot of questions about other things, other open source efforts you guys are working on.
Yeah, we'd love to talk more about those. Yeah, maybe we'll schedule some follow-ups. But yeah, it's been really fun. Thanks for having us. This was a lot of fun to talk about on these different topics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you guys
it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
So thank you guys for joining. If there's nothing else, I think usually I ask some kind of common questions, but what state management solution you guys use is definitely one of my questions, and I don't think I need to ask that one. It's quite clear. I think you guys already answered another question, which is like any kind of tips for developers, right? It's just basically just like, go at it. just keep going hard and this kind of stuff. It seems to be that's going to be probably the answer,
I think
right?
another thing to that point that I always try to tell people is like the best resource for Flutter, in my opinion, is Flutter itself. Like if you want to know how to do something, like personally, if I want to know how to do something, the first place I look is GitHub Flutter/Flutter and like search for the thing I'm looking for. And like 99% of the time I find the answer in either the code itself or in the documentation within the code. So I think that's a huge tip that like you don't really get that everywhere, that you can just like command click on like a class from the framework and then jump straight to the implementation and the documentation. And especially like if you're wondering, if you're trying to get into testing, for example, and you want to know like, oh, how do I test something? Like, how do I test some like platform component that has a method channel or whatever? Like the Flutter repo is just like an endless resource for all of those types of things. And so, yeah, my advice is like, just try to like look for what you're like trying to learn more about, or like examples of what you're trying to achieve within the repo itself. And a lot of times you'll find what you're looking for, and you know that it was written by people who know what they're doing because they're the ones who maintain the framework. So it's an awesome resource.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. Not many people mention, but yeah, that's true. Always check the Flutter docs and Flutter Flutter repository.
Yeah, Jorge, I don't know if you have any special tips.
No, just the cool thing about Flutter, I think, from the point of view of, I mean, the tech is super important, but I think also Flutter is so important because of the community, right? It's a very warm and welcoming and supporting community, right? So to me, that's the most important thing, right? Like there's an opportunity for everyone as long as you're willing to learn, to support each other, and just be nice, right? Be like, enjoy the ride. Sometimes we tend to kind of like fall into these arguments about this tool is better than the other tool and all that stuff. Like, well, tools are just to get the job done. It is normal that we all have opinions. Sometimes we're going to have even data to drive our opinions and our decisions, right? But most importantly, and first and foremost, is that just be nice, enjoy the community, enjoy the company, right? Like, try to create a healthy environment. If we can achieve that, then the technology is a little bit of a side effect. That's the easy part that we can fix. We're just one pull request away to make it better, right? But cultural change takes effort, right? So making sure that we maintain a healthy community, it's key for the success of Flutter as well. So that to me might be, you can tell that Felix focuses on one thing. And
this is why we work well together. We balance each other out. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's always great if you can guys find somebody to balance yourself out with. It's not easy. Cool. And with that, I think we can wrap this up. Let's continue to talk over email. And thanks again for coming out.
Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Take care. Talk to you all later.